Hi, my name is Laura Turner. I'm the Executive Director for the Health Professional Student Association. And with me today is Dr. Emil Chuck, who is our Director of Advising Services.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for hosting this for us. And I know I'm really excited to be part of the Health Professional Student Association regarding advising.
Great. And you recently wrote an article that we published on Student Doctor Network about the virtual interviewing and how that has become so common now with COVID. So we wanted to ask you a few questions about some of the things that you had seen when you were working as an advising professional and what you anticipate students are going to see in the 2022 and 2023 admissions cycle. So first of all, what were some of the questions or adjustments that you saw when you were Director of Admissions?
So let me see. So there were a lot of different opportunities for me to see people just adjusting on the fly when the shutdowns were all occurring, when travel was being prohibited, just for everyone's safety. So there was a lot of last minute scrambling that occurred at the end of the first cycle to admit students in 2020 in the first place, where obviously most of the applications that they received, everyone was mostly interviewed in person, and maybe a small handful was interviewed online. When we started moving into the 21 cycle, it was apparent that we all had to convert over to some sort of an online format. So very quickly, many people had to become experts in Zoom or WebEx or all of these types of virtual conferencing software, and try to figure out ways to actually use the software to attract our students and to get them engaged. What we found was really challenging was things that we definitely relied on and took for granted when we did in-person interviews, you couldn't have anymore. So it's not like you could have small chats between students and admissions advisors, so you can get a sense of what the students are, having them come on campus a little bit early to get a better sense of the community prior to your interview day. All those sorts of opportunities really disappeared. All of the things that we did for recruiting was virtual. And so it was really hard to get to know individual students, especially as you were trying to, or as students were trying to apply and figure out what's going to happen with changes in how grading was happening, because some schools were going into pass-fail mode. Others were just not, there were significant delays in getting letters of recommendation out. So there was a lot of adjustments in terms of being much more flexible. And as a result, many of our programs have had to extend some of their deadlines, expand more opportunities so that people can get interviewed, and just really try to make sure that we give certainly all of our students a fair shot. But also we needed that additional time to train all of our faculty members so that they know what it was like to be online. So conversational interviews are pretty easy, relatively speaking. It's just a question of making sure that without ever having to visit other people's houses, how do you do virtual interviews such as this, and dealing with the technology that happened along the way. Multiple mini interviews became much more challenging because now we had to figure out how do we move people from one station to another station in the context of an entire day, all of those sorts of things. So really trying to figure out ways that people originally would say, let's completely recreate our individual interview day and transfer everything over into an online world. The translation just really wasn't happening as easily as we all anticipated. So many of the things that we relied on in terms of body language, in terms of, if we wanted someone to do a writing sample on interview day on site, that was impossible to do in many cases. So there were a lot of things that we all had to rely on in making sure that the technology really worked, and that we knew that our faculty and our students and the students we were interviewing had as much of a good rapport and relationship as much as technologically possible. So those are just some of the many different things we all had to really think about very intensively and very deliberately for months and months during the 21-22 cycle, and it will continue with some adjustments going into the next year too.
Now, did you see any big changes in how you made admissions decisions during the pandemic with the switch to virtual interviews?
Well, obviously I can only speak in general terms. So in terms of how admissions decisions would change with virtual interviews versus in person, again, some things that we originally had in play as pieces of how we got to know an applicant, whether it's engagement with an applicant outside of the one-on-one or specific interview question time, disappeared. So oftentimes we would want to get a sense of what this candidate was like, but we only had really insight from the individual interview period itself. And we couldn't get any insight from perhaps, for example, interactions with current students or interactions with staff, because those were much more limited as a result. And you'd be very surprised sometimes when you have a decision on a candidate and we're really not sure that this candidate really is interested in us, how those other sidebar conversations really tend to sway an admissions decision. And so all of those were taken away. And so how do we come up with a better way to understand if the student is truly engaged with us during a virtual interview session became really important. I hesitate to say whether people's decisions as candidates on how they engage in virtual interviews made a difference, but there are some instances where it's like, I'm sorry, I forgot that I only knew that I needed to be here during this certain period of time because that was when my interview was scheduled. So they failed to show up for like the early sort of get to know the school information session or get to know the faculty information session. So if you were focused just on interviews and you skipped the meet and greets, the virtual meet and greets early on, there are some cases where it mattered and there's some cases where it didn't. So it's really hard to tell, but again, just knowing that a student is truly interested in the school became a little bit harder to gauge as a result of basically having everyone be involved in virtual interviews.
Now, moving forward, what do you think some of the emerging trends are going to be for virtual interviews? Do you think we're going to continue to see virtual interviews? Obviously with the new variant, we don't know what's going to be happening. It's a fluid situation. But do you anticipate, even as we move out of the pandemic, that we might continue to see virtual interviewing as something that schools are doing?
I have a pretty strong sense that most faculty, most people who are involved in admissions recognize the way that virtual interviews really levels the playing field when it comes to cost. And we all recognize and know how expensive it is for one to apply to medical, dental, any of these other programs with the increased cost and sometimes inconvenience of having to go for an interview. So you need to buy your appropriate interview suit, you need to set aside time in your schedule, whether it's exams or it's at work. And so there's a strong realization that for making things more equitable for individuals who may not have those conveniences and resources to fly or drive to certain places, that I think virtual interviews will become a part of the process. Now, that said, what I think will likely happen is there is still going to be a good number of programs that will still rely on in-person interviews as well, or at least some sort of on-campus interaction. It could occur before an interview, it could occur after an interview. So one of the things that really I see that is happening is there's a real risk, or I say risk is a relative term, of people and programs doing hybrid interviews. And so you'll get a group of people that will offer you to do an interview on campus or do an interview virtually speaking, and you can choose which one or the other way you would like to have your interview conducted. There's a small risk in that because, of course, the standards are going to be very different in the means or the way that, as I mentioned, you actually interact with faculty or you interact with students or you get to know the campus. And even to this day, there's still some challenges when we're talking residency training and residency interviews where we'll expect people to be on campus because that's the fairest way. There's only certain times where our program directors and our assistant program directors are available, and they didn't like the convenience to the applicants of having all of those interviews be so spread out. They just are so used to having all their decisions happen in one or two specific weekends and having all of those decisions made in an appropriate amount of time. So that's one of the things that I will certainly see is coming up, in that I think many schools want to do virtual interviews. Some schools won't. And so you as an applicant may wind up deciding to go to one school versus another school based on how much they rely on virtual interviews or how they use virtual or on-campus interviews. How are they going to use all of those as a screening tool, or is it there's a lot that's still out there that we're still not sure that admissions professionals around need to be sure they know how to articulate, and the same thing goes with residency directors. So I'm pretty sure it's here to stay, but how it's going to be used is going to make things much more complicated.
So looking to the most immediate next cycle, we're nearing the end of the current admission cycle, but moving forward to the next one, what do you think you're going to see in this immediate next interview cycle, the 2022 to 2023?
So there's a few things that I know I wrote about in the article, which is sort of a warning shot for everyone who's thinking about applying for this immediate next cycle. Again, virtual interviews are likely to be here to stay, but what that's going to look like for you, not just as a pre-med, but any of the other health professional fields, is going to be variable. There are a lot of people that will use situational judgment tests, and the AAMC is likely to roll out more schools that are involved with their developed situational judgment test. That's different from the Casper situational judgment test in terms of what they test, what the output is and outcomes are. And I think many people in admissions are still trying to figure out whether one tool is better than the other, or should we use them both? Should we use it as a pilot to see if it helps us in decision making? We're not really sure. Aside from AAMC, all of the other health professional fields, I know I'm seeing them using different types of situational judgment tests or virtual interviews, or they're going to do something or another, or a hybrid. So all the other programs, whether we're talking dentistry or pharmacy, physical therapy, I'm seeing that they're using online assessments, whether they be in time, live virtual interviews, or they might be recorded or asynchronous virtual interview assessments, they like to call it. So I'm fairly certain that applicants will need to be prepared for all the possibilities. Once you get an invitation to interview, then you've got to decide, or you have to find out whether it's in person, online live, and what other ways that you can show that you're truly interested in that particular school outside of those activities. So we're not really sure other than that. One thing I will warn applicants is please make sure you don't stack your days with two interviews from two different institutions on the same day. That's not a good idea. And I think more and more schools still want you to dedicate your entire day, even if it's a virtual interview, to just pay attention and focus on them. That unfortunately is not going to change. So just be prepared and be aware of the variations of how it's going to change if it's going to be online only, if they will have some online, some in person, and how that's going to make changes and differences in the end when it comes to selecting a class. There's a lot that still needs to be disclosed. I'll put it that way.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to answer some additional questions. I think this will be really useful for students. I know there's probably a lot of uncertainty and with that, some fear about how things are going to change with virtual interviewing. So we appreciate your time, and we invite everyone to check out the resources that are available on studentdoctor.net for interviewing, as well as the other admission resources that we have available. Thank you, and have a good day.
We hope you have found this video helpful. If so, please like and subscribe to the Student Doctor Network YouTube channel. For more helpful articles and information, please head over to the Student Doctor Network website at studentdoctor.net.